Alrighty, good afternoon and welcome back. We've been on a bit of hiatus, a holiday. And here we are in lesson 19, which is on, as was announced in weeks previous, the First Council of Nicaea. And as you can see, it's part one. We will definitely be here next week for it, so there'll definitely be a part two. And depending on what I fit into part two, there may be a part three, but there will definitely be a part two that will come in the next lesson. Part of this afternoon, fortunately, it's a comparatively shorter lesson. There's a brief review from where we were in the last lesson nearly 2 months ago now, just to remind us all. And then the details we're looking at this afternoon in relation to the First Council of Nicaea are introductory very much in nature, explaining just some of the simple broad details about what the council is, what on earth a council even is, as well as what this one particularly is, as well as how it was convened, so that then in the next lesson we get into the meat and potatoes, so it were, the actual substance of the deliberations and then the canons or the conclusions of the council itself. Okay, so a shorter, more introductory lesson today and the substance in the next. So you'll notice there on the cover page of your study notes, as we usually have, here is a piece of artwork, in this case an icon, a Byzantine icon, of the council. This was created in the early medieval period. It's slightly anachronistic. The building that you see in the background in gold is Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral in Constantinople. That was built later on in the early 6th century during the reign of the Emperor Justinian the Great. This is 200 years prior, roughly speaking, to the building of Hagia Sophia. So it's slightly anachronistic, but it's simply meant to portray Constantinople. Not that it was in there, but Nicaea is near Constantinople. You see there a number of figures. You have presbyters and other such bishops and officials in the background. The figure there in the centre wearing a crown, hopefully if you can make that out, he's wearing a red and gold, or purple in this case, actually a purple robe, Tyrian purple as it's called, or Phoenician purple, and gold. That there is the emperor, the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, the first Christian Roman emperor, who we'll be talking about in part today. And then you have the bishops, some of the most notable of the bishops surrounding him, which we'll discuss more importantly in the next lesson, some of those central figures. And you'll see one poor chap laid out on the ground, almost in the fetal position at the bottom. It's a bit darkened, but you can see that's part of the point. It's darkened for a reason. So the light interplay is an important component here. Hagia Sophia, the cathedral of God there, and the most important, biggest one in the medieval world, is light and lit up with the light of God, and then the dark portion down the bottom, that figure is Arius, the heretic who kicked off this whole issue, and he's been brought low and of course was rightfully condemned as a result of what was then adjudicated at the council, and so that's what's portrayed there, and of course some of those details will more become lighted to us as we work through these various parts on the First Council. If you then turn through your pages, I just want to give a brief review of the Arian controversy. Again, this was covered in the last lesson. If you wanted to go back and look at that, you'd be able to find that on the website, on our website, katoombabaptist.org.au, or at our YouTube channel, of course. But just to refresh you on the basic points and principles, the Arian controversy, or Arianism, is named after its heresiarch, as we call it, or simply the arch-heretic, the man who actually came up with the ideas, Arius. The controversy arose in the early 4th century, about 10-ish to 20-ish years prior to the council being convened. The Council of Nicaea itself convened it in 325, as we'll get onto. And in the 10 to 15-ish years, nearly 20 years prior, is when that started to metastasize and develop. So the early 300s, i.e. the 4th century. Later on, in the century that would come afterwards, the 5th century church historian, Socrates Scholasticus, very much like Eusebius, who we've studied in the past, provides a lot of detail about this time particularly. He explains that Arius first became this controversial figure down in Alexandria. And we saw in the previous lessons this battle that then took place of ideas between Arius, presbyter there, and the Archbishop of Alexandria, whose name was Alexander. Fitting name for one who was in the city named after Alexander the Great. The four kind of basic tenets, and again, it's of course much more expansive than this, but the four basic principles or foundational principles of Arianism as a teaching we covered as well, but I've listed them for you again. Namely that in this particular kind of conceptual flow or logical flow, that the logos, the word, this concept very familiar to the Greeks, the one that John particularly, as the apostle explains, is Christ. The logos, or the word, Christ, is not of the same essence as the Father. This is a term which will become more important in the following lessons. Ousia, and how these Greek words work, keeping in mind that this is occurring in Nicaea, this is occurring in Greek-speaking lands. Greek is the language that's used here, so there's going to be a natural kind of interplay or overlap between Greek and English that I'll bridge the gap for us on, lest I waste my years of Greek study. Ousia is the word that we pronounce in the Nicene Creed, which comes out of this council and the next one, Constantinople, being of one substance with the Father by whom all things were made. That portion of the creed, that's that word ousia. It means essence or substance. In other words, it's speaking about his nature. So in other words, Arius taught that Jesus Christ and God the Father were not of the same nature. Okay? Big problem, mainly because nowhere in the Bible do we find that idea. In fact, we find its antithesis, or the opposite, that they are one and the same. Hence, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Right? I and the Father are one. Okay, etc., etc. We are the same, not in personhood, but again, this is an issue which gets worked out. And this speaks to, by the way, as we then go through why these councils are necessary, because where there's disagreement, you then need to actually have that proverbial battle over those ideas and actually figure out what's true. You don't arrive at truth by never talking to people and never actually thinking through things and actually voicing them out loud. Secondly, as a result of that, the universe was created through the Son. That's an accurate observation. And therefore, the Son must have existed, as in the S-O-N, the Son, must have existed prior to the universe and to time. So that's actually an accurate component. The problem is the starting principle. Right? It would be like in a mathematical equation, starting your large thesis by multiplying by 0. Okay, you're going to run into a bunch of problems because everything else you build upon from that, it's upon an erroneous foundation. Okay, his starting premise was dead wrong, and everything else that follows, whether it's correct or incorrect. So this second principle is correct. The one that follows, though, is incorrect because he's already made that error earlier on. So that third principle you see there, that there was a point, it's hard to say time because he believed, of course, that Christ pre-existed the universe and time itself, which is accurate. Hence why he says, before Abraham was, I am, right? And why he can talk about himself in the beginning, so on and so forth. But even though he pre-existed the creation of the world, he himself did not exist at a certain point. Because in essence, what Arianism teaches is that Christ was the first created being, which is that fourth point you see there. Okay, this comes up in this word which we'll see in coming weeks, xima or poema. Again, I'll explain what those mean in coming weeks, but nevertheless. Essentially, the order of creation, as far as Arius was concerned, is that God creates Jesus, and then through Jesus creates the cosmos or the universe. Does that make sense? Okay. That will serve as the foundation for what we then see as the resolution to these issues, because of course much of this is then going, well, what do the scriptures say about these issues? It's not good enough to merely just think through it logically and rationally, although that's a very important component. It does need to make logical sense, because that word logical is from that Greek word logos. Okay? Things should make sense when pieced together from start to finish. And if there's an error at either the beginning or somewhere during, or even at the end, then you're going to have problems like what you have here. So that's just a brief recap that I wanted to give you. If you hadn't been here in previous lessons, or if you want to learn more, go back to the previous lesson from this one, which was on the Arian heresy in more detail, okay? So, focusing on what we want to look at this afternoon is just as an introduction to the council, mainly about how it arose, and then particularly of the Emperor Constantine's role in its convening. Because of course he's a central figure, not just in the artwork that's then created as you see on page 1, but actually a central figure in the history of it, and his role is often largely misunderstood, just from a lack of historical knowledge or a shallow understanding thereof. So you'll see if you go to page 3 of your study notes, it's in figure 1, just to give you an idea as to where on earth, literally and figuratively, Nicaea actually happens to be. Hopefully, if you remember back to high school from your geography classes, you'll notice where on earth we are. Again, it also says there in English, so if you can't figure out at all where we are on earth, I don't know how to help you. We're in the Mediterranean Sea. The portions that you see there, of course, is the Anatolian Peninsula, what today is Turkey, and down through the Levant or Mesopotamia, countries like Syria and Lebanon, Iraq, so on. But you see also there the Greek Peninsula and the Balkans, as well as on the far western side, the Italian Peninsula. Okay, this is in the heart of the empire, and you see there a red little figure, a red little symbol, a star, and says Nicaea. It should be right there in the dead middle of your map on the screen above all your study notes. Constantinople, a bit hard to make out there. It's in its more ancient word Byzantium, which is where we get that term Byzantine Empire from. Constantinople, as you can maybe hopefully hear, or if you've studied it before, is named after Constantine. Constantine, during this time, he becomes the dominant emperor in the west of the empire in 313 after defeating Maximinus and Maxentius. He then is co-reigning with an emperor in the east. In 324, he then becomes the unified emperor. Okay. During this time of difficulties and other such things, Rome has multiple emperors, not for the first time and not for the last either, but he then becomes the unified emperor over the entire territory in 324. He moves the capital to Byzantium, as it was historically called. He renames it Nova Roma, or New Rome, and then later it's named in his honour Constantinople, or Constantinopolis, the city, polis of Constantine. This is where the next council occurs, which we cover when we get onto that. The first council of Constantinople in 381, which is kind of like a round 2 of the Council of Nicaea, but we'll get onto that when we get onto it. Nevertheless, Nicaea is right near there. For those who have been in our Bible study, if you look just below Nicaea, you'll see the word Asia. You'll know that province, that Roman province, from where we've been in the book of Acts. A lot of those churches, Ephesus and Smyrna, Pergamum, Philadelphia, the 7 churches of Asia that we find in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, that's where that is, okay? And we've been spending a lot of time in and around these parts in the book of Acts with Paul's missionary journeys. So anyway, that's just to give you a brief idea of where Nicaea actually is geographically, okay? So, in regards to an introduction for us, the Council of Nicaea, or as we call it, the First Council, because there's another one later on in the 8th century. The First Council of Nicaea, the most famous Council of Nicaea, is what's considered the first ecumenical council. Okay, you may have heard that term before, may not, and that's fine. But it's the first ecumenical council in church history. It's not the first church council. Again, in Bible study, we've covered that in Acts chapter 15, the Council of Jerusalem in AD 50. That was the first church council. In that case, convened and presided over by the apostles, particularly James in that case, who was Bishop of Jerusalem at the time. Ecumenical is something then altogether different. It comes from this Greek word oikumene, meaning the inhabited world or the worldwide. Okay? And we've explained in Bible studies as well as in some sermons that this term that gets used in the New Testament, you'll often have it translated as the whole world or the inhabited world in various portions. Christ uses it in the Olivet Discourse, for example, in Matthew 24. It gets used in the book of Revelation. It gets used elsewhere. It's describing this exact state of the empire. As far as people during the time of the Roman Empire were concerned, Rome had effectively conquered the world. Okay, that was the broad, essentially universal understanding of everyone. Anyone beyond those lands, the ancient Germanians, Scythians, the Parthian Empire, later on the Sassanid Empire, to the east in the Iranian lands, what today is Iran, were simply just considered fringe barbarians. Of course, Rome's famous battles with the Germanians, the ancestors of the Germans, those legendary battles of Teutoburg Forest and other such figures like Arminius and so on. Those were just considered pagan barbarians off in distant lands that didn't matter. Rome had conquered every square inch of the Mediterranean at its height, and it had effectively conquered the whole world, and that was the common understanding. Okay? It had conquered and ruled the oikoumene, the inhabited world or the whole world. Right? Hence, that term ecumenical getting used is describing, in this case, a council of bishops and presbyters, church officials from all around the world, i.e. all around the empire. And in fact, actually, in this case, it drew from more, which I'll mention in a second. But nevertheless, it drew, there's some historical debate as to what the specific number is. Some figures at the time or in around the time give as low as 250, some give about 270, some give 318, which is why they've given that specific number there. Largely depending on who they are or are not including. But nevertheless, it was about 300 plus or minus of bishops from around the Roman Empire, from around the oikoumene, the world. And each bishop was able to bring with him 2 presbyters and 3 other assistants, basically 3 deacons of the church. And so the total attendance is usually estimated to be somewhere up around 1,800, right? All around the world, travelling in by horseback, sailing in, of course, most of them as well from all around the world. This is what ecumenical means in this context, okay? An ecumenical council, or a council drawn from all around the empire or the world. And in fact, it actually drew it from even beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. Rome's primary enemy to the east, at this time the Sassanid Empire, the Iranian or the Second Persian Empire as it's called, also sent delegates. Christianity was not quite as large in the Sassanid Empire as it was in Rome by this point, but nevertheless delegates from those churches in lands today that are Iraq, kind of eastern Syria, Christian lands like Georgia and Armenia, which have been Christian almost since day one, since very early on, since the 1st and 2nd centuries, as well as, of course, Iran. Those churches also sent delegates as well. So this was people from all around the world. And so that's what this term ecumenical means. And that part of, obviously, the nature of it, but it really more speaks to the significance of the importance of this issue. Nevertheless, a lot of these bishops were drawn from a particular area. So whilst being ecumenical in that nature and very much being unprecedented in regards to how widespread the scope of its representation was, of course the vast majority of delegates were from the eastern provinces of the empire, which is where this issue was largely flourishing. As I mentioned in the review we just had, as well as obviously in more detail in the previous lesson on Arianism, Arianism was born essentially in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay, a city founded by Alexander when he conquered it in the late 330s BC, founded in his name among the other 26 cities founded in his name across that part of the world, but Alexandria, Egypt is definitely the most famous of them. Arius was presbyter at the time in Alexandria, so it's an eastern city, Greek-speaking. Greek and Egyptian people are very much intermingled heavily by that point, especially by the time we talk here. And so that impacts the nature of the council. Again, it had spread up to Antioch. It was also taking a lot of root in Antioch as well, unfortunately, one of the most ancient churches. And so all Eastern and Greek. So the West only had, I think off memory, about 5 bishops actually present. Of course, there were many more delegates from the West, but in terms of bishops and leaders of the church, there was only about 5 out of that 300 number, roughly. This impacts how the creed ends up being formulated, but again, later weeks than what we're looking at here. One of the important things that becomes vital to understand as well is the way in which these issues, to use that word I used earlier, metastasize or spread. This issue was born in the eastern portions of the world, in the Greek-speaking portions. The language that gets employed, is why I mentioned that word earlier, ousia, or substance or essence, in other words, the nature of who God is, his nature, is a Greek word, and that becomes an extremely important point and word, as we'll see in coming weeks. The distinction, rather, between what's accurate and inaccurate ends up being a single letter in one single word. Again, I won't explain what it means here, but the difference between whether one upheld what was called homoousia or homoiousia, which has an eye or not an eye, which seems like, what on earth does that mean? But you'll see its significance as it plays through. Why do I bother pointing that out? Well, for our lesson, again, this is an important principle at any time, not just ours. Words really matter. The meaning of words really matter. The way in which we communicate really matters, and I don't just mean in terms of how nice or polite we are. I mean the actual way in which we explain concepts. Language is a gift given by God to be able to transcend the gap between the mind and the world around it. Okay, the words that get used then can be the linchpin between good and evil in the world. Everything that we do, everything that we say ultimately is preceded by thought, even though we describe things as someone having acted thoughtlessly or carelessly, which certainly can happen. The problem is that they didn't put enough thought into the issue. They only put a trivial amount of thought into the issue, which is exactly the problem. Because even in someone's thoughtless or careless acts, the problem lies in those very thoughts or cares being shallow or being uncaring or so on and so forth, right? Everything that we do is preceded by thought. Everything that we do is preceded from the mind. This is why in the Old Testament, as well as of course through the New, you see the command given to God's people to inscribe upon their forehead and upon their hand the name of God and of his motto, what we describe as Shema. Shema Yisrael Yahweh Eloheinu Yahweh Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Okay? It's not talking about the Israelites or God's people in large, and ourselves included, tattooing that on our forehead or on our hand or something. It's talking about the forehead, the mind, the will, as well as the hand, our actions, okay, our deeds. So in other words, in thought and in deed, right? This becomes, and you're going to see a deeply historical example of how this impacts quite literally things on a worldwide scale in this case. The world, or the civilized world at this time, was much smaller than what our conceptualization of the world is today, of course. But these distinctions of words, what they mean, how they're getting used, so not just in thought and writing, but how they then actually end up impacting the practice of people's lives and communities and churches and everything else, ends up spreading throughout the entire world. Later on in the West, this becomes an issue. The East resolves the issue, but the lingering effect trails into the West. Many of the Germanic tribes, for example, during the time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, adopt Arianism. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, the Lombardians, the Burgundians, etc., etc. Many of those people, ancestors of lands that you may or may not be familiar with. Of course, the Franks are the ancestors of France. The Burgundians landed in the place of France called Burgundy. Lombardians in Lombardy, so on and so forth. They adopt Arianism later on. So this isn't an issue which is just quashed here at Nicaea, but its ultimate defeat, the severing of its lasting effect or power, is certainly dealt with at Nicaea, and then, as the history of the world often testifies, the wheels of history move slowly. Okay, and so Arianism in the West is not quashed out until really about 600, roughly, so nearly 300 years after this. That's how time progresses, and that's how things move forth. They take time. But much as Christ has dealt with the power of death, the power of sin, and our slavery to it on the cross, his kingdom then marches forth, and everywhere that it spreads, light dawns on that darkness. Okay? The war has been won, but then you've got to quash the spot fires as you move, as the light of Christianity moves forward and spreads through to the world, as the grace and forgiveness which comes only through Christ for our evil, which none of us can achieve, spreads forth. It's much like this. This issue gets resolved at Nicaea, and then definitively resolved, like really resolved, at Constantinople 50 years later. But that takes time to affect the rest of the world. And so you'll see that play out. But it's important to understand this on the principle level, which is the errant ideas of one single individual end up determining entire portions of the fate of the Roman Empire for the next 300 years. Right? bad ideas can spread like poison. And that's why the law of God is so important, and that's why order as opposed to chaos is important. That's why hierarchy as opposed to just a free-for-all is vitally important, because not because it quashes and oppresses, but rather because it guards and protects that which is true and good, as opposed to giving free rein to that which is evil, to that which causes not human flourishing but rather human suffering, spiritually, physically, or otherwise. On that note, let's move forward to the final component, as I said, much shorter lesson today, which is going to be namely on the role of Constantine the Great as emperor. As I mentioned in the introduction, Emperor Constantine ascends to the emperorship in and around his battles and wars against competing claimants in the early 310s. He has a famous victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 313, and then becomes emperor in the west. He then becomes the unified emperor in 324, which is what then sets the path for this convening of this particular council. So, as I've touched on in times past, he converts to the faith in 313. According to history, he is at that battle, that famous Battle of Milvian Bridge, against his enemies. He then sees a sign in the heavens with a cross and with basically an inscription of Christ's name, what we call the Chi-Rho, or the Hero, what to us would look like an X and a P, but is the first two letters of Christ's name. He is then told or sees in that sign a Latin phrase, in hoc signes vinces, in this sign have victory, or in this sign go forth and conquer. He inscribes it on the shields of his men as opposed to the pagan symbols which they normally held on their shields. They win that battle. They then win every battle basically after that, and Constantine, I would argue rightfully, takes this as the literal and figurative sign that the God of the Christians is actually true. Okay. He was familiar with Christians, of course. The Diocletianic persecution, which we covered in lessons past, raged from about 303 to 313, that 10-year period, which was the worst persecution that Christianity had ever faced. It had tens of thousands of Christians massacred and tortured to death in all manner of the typical horrific ways as the Romans were accustomed to. But praise be to God, that ended when Constantine won his battles, converted to the faith, and legalized Christianity. Okay, as we explained before in previous lessons again, Christianity was considered religio illicita in Latin, or an illegal religion. It claimed that there was another king other than Caesar. It said that there was one God, not a pantheon. It said that this God was immortal as opposed to the Roman pantheon, so on and so forth. It rejected the Roman gods. It rejected Caesar as God, or as the son of a god, really, Divi Filius, and was illegal and punished and persecuted to the ends of the earth, literally and figuratively. Constantine ends that. Okay, it's why, for example, at times, the very, very modern phenomenon, no one ever used to hold this for obvious reasons, but because it just wasn't true, but there's been a bit of a resurgence in the idea it mainly only exists in certain evangelical circles, that Constantine was a bad guy, or Constantine was the cause of much of corruption in the church. The problem is that it doesn't stack up historically at all. It doesn't bear out with the historical evidence, and also no one in the history of the church ever believed that, which is also not the basic reason, but it's one of the additional reasons. The work that God did through the Emperor Constantine is very, very clear from the history of from the testimony of history, and his conversion to the faith is also equally clear. It's not as nice and clean as we often like to think, but then often we should perhaps hold a mirror up to ourselves first before reaching through the annals of time and pronouncing judgment on figures 1700 years ago. But that's a whole other issue. Nevertheless, through what's called the Edict of Milan, which is where that was signed, he then legalizes Christianity. So in other words, it's now free and open to practice. You're no longer going to be persecuted. About 5 minutes after the Edict of Milan, Christians start building churches because now they know that they're not going to be have those churches burnt to the ground with them in them. They come out from hiding underground, literally. They're no longer suppressed and persecuted, which is good, and praise be to God. And so that's the context in which a lot of this is unfolding and taking place. As the Arian controversy, speaking of unfolding, as it unfolds, in that following decade, basically from the Edict of Milan all the way through to 324, 325 AD, right when this council is about to be convened, the issue is getting more and more contentious, more and more heated, let's just say, and it's starting to impact things on a cultural level. It's starting to disturb the peace, as we would say in common law, in modern common law. It's starting to impact on how things are operating in broader society. Tempers and emotions are starting to run a bit too wild and flare up. There is a riot here and there, so on and so forth, right? Constantine, of course, naturally wants to bring this back to order as opposed to the chaos which is starting to fester as a result. And rightfully so, that's his responsibility as the bearer of the sword, as king or as emperor. And so he seeks to resolve the issue between Arius and Archbishop Alexander. Okay. At this point, by the time this is building up across this decade, Constantine doesn't quite understand, well, A, for starters, doesn't understand the full nature of the issue. As a result of that, he doesn't really understand the gravity of the issue. Okay, so by nature, I mean in terms of the actual substance of the arguments, and then because he doesn't quite understand the substance of the arguments yet, he grossly underestimates how important an issue that is. Does this make sense? Yep. Understandable. Again, he's a little bit busy with running an empire, dealing with an issue that sprung up in one of the cities in the far southeast corner of his empire is not exactly something which is going to fly across the desk of the emperor. This doesn't quite help, though, of course, because the issue is actually much more complex and much more serious. But anyway, in 324, when he becomes unified emperor, like I mentioned earlier, he writes a letter to both of those men, to both Arius and to Alexander, essentially imploring them to resolve this issue. And as I mentioned, he at the time thought it was a rather insignificant issue. They both were honouring Christ as God. They both held him in high esteem. They both were proclaiming the gospel, etc., 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 all surface level things, of course. So the significance of the issue he didn't really understand, right? As things progress forward, though, he fortunately does come to understand these issues in a bit greater depth. One of the quotations from the letter that he has, you'll see it on the beginning of page 3 now of your study notes, but on screen there for you as well. He writes to them one of the key components that's addressing this concept I'm talking about from his letter. He says, quote, "For as long as you continue to contend about the small and very insignificant questions, I believe it indeed to be not merely unbecoming, but positively evil, that so large a portion of God's people which belong to your jurisdiction should be thus divided." Okay. So whilst not attributing to it the significance that it actually needed, you can see, hopefully, the heart of Constantine on the issue. He's concerned for the people who this is now affecting. You see the picture? He's concerned with all of the congregants and all of the Christians in Alexandria and elsewhere, Antioch, so on and so forth. But in this case, he's addressing those two from Alexandria, who are suffering through this division, through schism, through infighting, through debate on the best of days and right on the worst. And he that's why he calls it not merely unbecoming but positively evil, right? He's concerned with the disruption and the chaos it's causing for all of the congregations in Alexandria, okay? Now again, he's correct. This is why it's actually so significant. So the undervaluing of the significance is only because he doesn't actually yet grasp the full depth of the issue. He still thinks, because of course he's not travelling to Alexandria, he's receiving reports from his people, from those who work in the royal court, in the imperial court rather, and how effectively those people were communicating the issue, because those officials would have been getting told by officials from Alexandria, who would have been told by officials from certain areas of Alexandria, So I suppose in one sense this proves that ancient bureaucracies were just as incompetent as modern ones, but nevertheless, the bureaucratic quagmire that an emperor had to deal with is kind of what's impacting this here. Okay, That's why being fair and balanced with people is important, especially in history, especially for dead men who can't mount a defence for themselves. That's just a good principle anyway. But yes, nonetheless, this is his primary concern: the disruption, the chaos this is causing for the congregations of Alexandria. So, fortunately, during that kind of year leading from 324 to 325, the year leading into when the council was ultimately convened at Nicaea, a number of other bishops from around the empire, including those ones close to the imperial court, fortunately are able to communicate with Constantine and enlighten him, so it were, to the seriousness of the issue, to the fact that this is not trivial at all. Arius is actually completely undermining the divinity of Christ, and he's actually proclaiming falsehoods about God, which impacts all the way down to people's own salvation, right? The logical flow of how these things cascade like a river. It starts small, and the brook develops into a river, which flows into a delta, which turns into the sea. Same thing with ideas. It's not a trivial thing at all. Arius is ultimately besmirching and blaspheming Christ and who he is. He is proclaiming Jesus to be something that he's not, which is exactly what we saw in last week's sermon about taking the Lord's name in vain, right? Saying things that God didn't say, or not doing the things that God did say, right? That's exactly what's going on here ultimately. So fortunately, a number of different bishops and other such church officials are able to explain that to him. He fortunately sees how important this issue is, and then does something which, again, the sovereignty of God over history, now for the first time was actually possible. An ecumenical council in previous centuries would have been impossible, even though there were plenty of issues on which they were needed. But previously, church councils were regional or metropolitan, so they were in a given city or they were in a given region of a Roman province, and they were convened by the church authorities in that particular city, right? So previous councils could only be convened by, of course, the authority that you held. You could have, I'm just picking an example here, you could have authority in the Church of Antioch, and you could ask bishops from around the rest of Christendom to come, but at the end of the day, your authority is in Antioch, not Jerusalem or Alexandria or Rome, and you have no way of making them come to that, even no matter how important of an issue you happen to think it is. In this case here, you have the emperor, unified emperor now, who has jurisdiction over, obviously, the whole empire, who now has the authority, rightfully so, I'm saying this is a positive thing, has the authority to then actually be able to convene bishops and deacons and everything else, and presbyters from around the empire. This is a blessing of this position, and we'll talk about authority kind of as we get just to the end here in a moment. But he calls those from around the empire who have informed him of how serious this actually was. Ultimately, any resolution outside of a church council fails, of course, otherwise the council wouldn't have been necessary. And so upon that failure for Arius and Alexander, and then everyone else who sided with either side, their failure to resolve these issues is then the kind of flashpoint for then Constantine stepping in, convening a council of the bishops from all around the empire, all around the world, to meet, in this case, in Nicaea, and to hash these issues out and to work these things through and to figure them out, to come to the scriptures, to work on them, and so on and so forth. And so he convenes it as a result. One such historical source, citing a number of primary sources, explains that, again, Constantine himself summoned the bishops to end this dispute. The council was not called specifically by a church official. Okay, and the reason why it's important is because this council in particular, among many other things which we'll see in the coming weeks, establishes two very, very important ecclesiastical principles as well as legal ones. Okay, so not just in regards to church practices or what's called canon law, right, church laws, but also the concept of what the relationship between the king and the law actually is within his realm. The first of which is that the king has a legal responsibility to combat heresy within his realm. Okay? Of course, we're going through the Ten Commandments, and we've explained this in previous weeks, and we'll continue to explain. We do not get to cherry pick what laws of God we like. and what ones we do or don't want to enforce, what ones we do or don't want to uphold. Either last week or the week before, I think it was last week, when I explained that in our current society we kind of enforce maybe 2.5 of them. we enforce against murder, we enforce against theft, certain kinds of theft, and we enforce lying sort of in certain contexts, like in certain contexts with the police, with, of course, the courts under perjury. And so in governmental instances, we have that, and certain contract laws and tort laws and so on. But the rest we do nothing about. Okay, the public ones, that is. So adultery, we do nothing about. The honouring of mother and father, we do nothing about. All four of the first four, right? So the entire first table doesn't get enforced at all, right? It's completely in contravention and contradistinction to what the church had historically understood and practiced, what Christians, be they church officials or kings, had ever practiced. This was something which Christianity understood widely, because these laws are fundamentally good. They are conducive to human flourishing as opposed to human degradation, and they uphold the righteousness and the justice of God in your land. The king or the polity of whatever kind it happens to be doesn't have a choice. There's no options. They're not the 10 suggestions, they're the 10 commandments. And this was something which was widely understood. Therefore, obviously heresy, which is at some point contravening one of the first four, if not usually multiple points, falls within the legal jurisdiction of, like what we saw last week, particularly from that little reference we had to Romans 13 about the governing authority, the king having the authority, bearing the sword, as Paul puts it, to protect the good and punish the evil. Okay? That if you do what's good in the sight of God, and if the king is actually upholding that, then you have no fear of the king. That's a good thing. But if you do what's evil, if you do what's corrupt, if you do what's chaotic and dark, and you violate the law of God, and the king is doing his job and upholding that, then you have every reason to fear facing justice, rightful justice. The murderer should fear facing the sword, which even again, that's why I say we kind of enforce 2.5, because the scriptures have no concept other than death being the rightful punishment for murder. Okay, that you do not just get to spill unjustifiably blood of someone else to cut their one single mortal life short and then not face the justice of having that happen to you. Right? We water down even the ones that we do actually implement. The king has a legal authority and responsibility, more importantly. It's not just tyrannical power. I'm talking about actual responsibility, a sacred obligation, in fact, a duty before God to combat heresy within his realm. Not that he's the one who defines what heresy is, right? Because like we saw from Romans 13, in that passage, what's considered good and evil, who defines what that is? Does the king define what's good and evil? No. Who does? God, right? That passage entirely assumes that good and evil are already defined by someone else who's not the king, okay? The king has the obligation and the duty to enforce that by law, to protect the good, to punish the evil, but he doesn't define what's good and evil. King David didn't define what's good and evil. King Solomon did not define what's good and evil. Wicked kings, like Ahab, did not define what's good and evil. Righteous kings, like Hezekiah and Josiah, also did not define what's good and evil. Whether they were good or evil kings in the history of the kingdom of Israel, those good or bad kings themselves did not define what's good and evil. God does, right? And the king is also accountable to it himself. But this concept we basically have eliminated from society. Okay, and not only have we we've eliminated it from society because we've eliminated it from large portions of the church. There's still plenty that uphold that concept, but nevertheless we've largely purged that concept, right? The problem is, speaking of responsibilities and authorities, we don't have the authority to do that. We don't have the authority to change the law of God. I know that seems overly simplistic, but that's one of our modern ills. We have assumed unto ourselves a feigned mantle to change what God has already said, and every time we do, we violate the third command. We don't do what God has already said, or we say things that God didn't say. Right? The king has a legal responsibility from sacred scripture, from God, to combat heresy within his realm. I want you to also note the operative part of this, because this forms the second point that's there, that I'm making there. Within his realm. Okay, that can't be missed either. The Roman emperor, irrespective of how they viewed themselves, as far as God's concerned, has no authority to enforce what's going on in the Sassanid Empire to the east of them at this time. Okay, their other major world power rival. The Sassanid king needs to enforce the law of God in his lands. Of course, there's a time when war sadly and unfortunately breaks out. There is a time when things have become so horrifically evil in a place that a neighbouring country or nation, a kingdom, may actually have a moral obligation to intervene. We should be far more cautious with those principles than we have been in the last 50 to 60 years. But nonetheless, that's a whole other geopolitical issue. But within his realm, okay? In this case, Constantine is emperor over the entire Mediterranean world. He is the emperor over the oikoumene, the inhabited world. He has the legal responsibility and the right to convene the bishops. I agree with that. Because he bears the sword, the instrument or the tool of justice, to combat, in this case, heresy within his realm. This impacts a whole host of things which we'll see in church history kind of in the months that come as we work our way through, particularly in the medieval period. Much of this debate flared up again during the Reformation 500 years ago, roughly speaking. It led to a whole host of other principles about whose religion, whose realm, whose religion, and other such things which I won't bore you with now. But nevertheless, the king has a legal responsibility to combat heresy within his realm. The scriptures from start to finish bear that out, including in the New Testament. Okay? And we need to recapture that understanding, because when you meet all those Christians who we will be with forever, 99+% of them will be bewildered that we don't believe that. Okay? Because this is what's clear through the scriptures. And again, we could spend all day going through those texts if we so wanted to. But nevertheless, point number 2, which follows on from that, is that the king is the one who holds the authority to then convene a church council, again, operative part of that clause, within his realm. Okay? Whilst the church and, to use the modern term, church and state, which has become completely altered in its understanding of what it ever meant over previous centuries. It means something very different now. But nevertheless, the distinction between the authority of the church and the authority of the king exists. They're not one and the same thing. So the king is not uniquely king of the church. We already have one of those, and his name is Jesus. Christ is king over the 3 different spheres of authority, as the scriptures will often allude to and highlight: the family, the church, and the king or the state, the government, however you conceptualize it. Those 3 different realms of authority are interrelated, they intermingle, right? Churches are made up, of course, of people, so families, and kingdoms are made up of people, families, and churches, and so on and so forth. There's an overlap between these various spheres, but they each retain within them a distinction from the other. The family is not the church is not the family, the church is not the state is not the church. Okay, we've explained this concept in sermons that have happened in times past. But this serves as an important point that by virtue of his authority within that given realm, the king has the authority to convene a church council within his realm. Okay. Not only in principle, but also in practice. Again, you could convene a church council here. So suppose by some blessed miracle, we ended up with a devout, committed Christian cabinet and government, and they then used the authority to then convene a church council to solve the endless list of problems that we currently have. They'd have no authority, either in principle or in practice, to demand that church officials from North America or Europe or Africa come over here to resolve the issues. Does that make sense? I know it's a very simplistic example, but has no authority because he just literally doesn't even have the pragmatic authority. He can't enforce that which is beyond his realms, outside of the only means, which would be, of course, war. But that now opens up a whole other issue. He has the authority, though, to convene a church council within his realm. And this is how church councils were then rightfully convened. Prior to Constantine, prior to the emperors now becoming Christian, praise be to God, church councils could only ever be convened at, as I said earlier, a metropolitan or a regional level, okay, where the church officials in that city or in that region convened those within that city or region. They had no ability to convene with others and have them come as well. They could, of course, invite them, and that did happen, right? But in terms of what happens with regards to those who don't want to come. So, for example, in this particular case, what's the phrase I'm looking for? The joy that the Arians felt at wanting to come to this particular council was not exactly high. Okay, their desire to come and convene with those who were standing against them, the Trinitarians, the non-Arians, those following Alexander, their impetus for wanting to come to this council was not all that high as a general principle. Okay, I'm speaking very broadly here. But they needed to be there because these issues needed to get resolved. So the king has the authority to convene them. No, you will come or you will be breaking the law. Okay? And to make no mistake, I'm absolutely saying that's a good thing. Okay? That is a definitively good thing. It is entirely in line with the king's authority, Old or New Testament. It's entirely within keeping of his responsibilities before God to maintain orthodoxy or true value, true belief in his realm. This is why, as we've seen in previous weeks, the kings that refuse to do this in the history of the Old Testament go evil, turn evil, and are condemned as such. The kings that instead drive out evil from their land, they end human sacrifice, they end ritual sexual slavery, so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. They purge the land of idols. They are praised as good. This is the exact concept. So that's the impetus for Constantine's authority. He had all the authority to do that, rightfully so, from the scriptures, not even just from Roman law, but also from the scriptures as well. And Constantine is the one that then convenes the council. He's represented in the council by one of his officials, but we'll get onto that next week when we talk about that more. But nevertheless, that serves as the ending here of the lesson. You have Constantine being a central component. In convening this council, he had all the authority to do so, and it sets that precedent that then becomes really a fundamental component of the history of particularly Europe ever since. And so especially during the medieval period and the early modern period. So that's the end of the lesson.